This week on World Traveler Cooking, we're going to make New England style, or maybe Boston style, depending on how you define these, clam chowder. This is an American winter soup, chock full of seafood, potatoes, and a few veggies, which came out of basically the Northeast United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. And current thinking is that it was maybe based on some Portuguese seafood soups. However, another aspect of this is that the very early chowders appear to have been ways of trying to make hardtack edible. Hardtack was basically you take some flour, mix it with some water, and bake it until it's basically like a brick. And then it's very shelf stable. You can take it on ships. Moisten it and eat it is basically a raw source of calories. So early chowders may have been a way of making hardtack edible. Eventually they substituted something called common crackers and later on even potatoes for that. And most of the chowders you see today are made with potatoes. This is going to be a fairly simple chowder. I have 4 kilograms, that's about 8.5 pounds of clams. Now these are what they call in Indonesia here tofu, which literally means tofu clams, obviously due to the color. They're not obviously made of tofu, of course. And so this will be the source both of the broth and of the clams themselves. Sometimes people do use canned clams, and if you use canned clams, it's really important that you don't throw away the juice because the clam juice is really the best source of broth for this. We're going to get sort of clam juice when we steam these open, which is the first thing we'll do here. Then let's start with the next thing we'll add will be bacon. I'll probably use half of this. We'll chop it up, and this will form the oil base for the saute of the onions and veggies. So we have an onion, we have some not very happy looking celery here, but it's what I have. And I'm just gonna chop this finely. If you're using US celery, maybe use nice big stalk or a couple of smaller ones. Then we will have potatoes. We may add a little water. We'll definitely add water when we steam the clams. We will add some cream. I don't quite know how many of these yet. I might add all 3. And some people add flour and butter as a sort of a roux in order to thicken it. That's optional. The traditional way to thicken chowder is by mashing some of the potatoes into the broth to thicken it. But you can also use a roux if you like a really, really thick chowder. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that today. There will also be some, possibly some salt, depending on how salty these clams are, as well as perhaps a bit of pepper, and definitely, as I said before, some water. This is a very, very simple soup. It's not hard to make. Don't be afraid of trying to make it. And some people, of course, do add like a little bit of parsley or a little bit of herbs. But keep in mind this was originally a winter soup. And in the winter, you don't have so much in the way of herbs in the northeastern United States. So we're going to make do with the very basic ingredients today. At any rate, let's get started. Our first step is going to be to steam these clams open. And while we steam the clams, we will start preparing the vegetables, the bacon and vegetables for the sauté base. So what I've done here so far is I have put all these in a pot. I've added some water onto the bottom. I don't have a lid that fits perfectly, but that's all right, so I'm just going to put this on. I'm going to turn the stove on, and we'll just go ahead and let this cook until it's boiling and the clams have all opened. So I've already diced the onions, chopped the celery, and cut the bacon. This bacon is really lean, so I'm using about 100 grams. You want to render enough to have enough that you can comfortably saute the onions, but you don't want a lot of extra fat. So keep that in mind. Next, we're going to take the potatoes, peel them, and cut them into cubes that should be maybe 4 millimeters or so in diameter, about a quarter of an inch or so. And yeah, we'll put those in another bowl and get them ready. So now you can see that these clams have all steamed open, and you can actually, if you look on the edge there, see if I take it here so you can see it better. There's actually quite a lot of broth in here. That's basically clam juice, and that's going to form the basis of our broth here. So next step is for the clams, I'm going to deshell them. I'm going to take all the clam meat and put it aside, and the shells in another place, and I'm going to save all the broth because we're going to use that later. So I've cut about 1 kilogram of potatoes into little pieces suitable for the soup, and the 4 kilograms of clams led to 1 liter, or about a quart, of clam broth, plus about 400 grams, that's about 1 pound, of clam meat. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've got to step away for a few minutes, and while I'm away, I'm sure these will brown a little bit, but that's okay. They will, I think, cook off and return back to their nice color as they cook. So I'll be back in a little bit. So because I'm interested in rendering the fat, I'm starting this on a cold pan, and I'm heating it up. And there may not be enough fat here, so I still have a little bit of lard I might supplement with. I might have to add 1, maybe 2 tablespoons of lard. And I think, in fact, I'm going to do that, because it doesn't look like it's going to render much. And then from there, we will go ahead and add our onions in a few moments. Now, if you don't have lard, you could use even oil. But the point is that you need some fat. And frankly, the main point of the bacon, or in some cases salt pork, is the fat. So now that this is rendered, I'm going to start adding my onions. So now these are starting to get browned a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and start adding my celery. So now all of the onions have been added, and stirring around for a bit, you can see it's starting to brown a bit. At this point, it's perfectly fine if stuff's sticking to the bottom, because as we add the broth, it'll all come up, and we'll add the broth very shortly. Just note that you don't want it to burn. It's fine, though, for it to stick a bit. So next we'll start adding the broth. So now I'm adding the clam broth. Just going to add it here. I like to add a little bit and then deglaze. You can see just not too much at once. And then this basically allows you to get everything off the bottom. And then usually I'll just add the rest. Basically, at this point, we're turning this into a soup. We'll definitely add the clams. I think you can see the clams in there already. And yeah, we'll go ahead and keep adding this up. Once we have that there, we'll add the potatoes, and then we'll cook it until everything's soft. So as I warned you, the potatoes would brown just a little bit. That's not the end of the world. As you'll see, they will cook back to the nice light color as we cover them with the broth. Now, if you don't have quite enough broth here, you can supplement with a bit of water and maybe a bit of salt. But the main point is to stew the potatoes in the clam broth here. And then we'll let this cook for a while, and then we'll come back and see how thick it is. So I have just seasoned this with pepper to taste, and I've tasted it, and it's actually already too salty. So I'm not going to add any salt now, but keep in mind the potatoes are going to absorb a lot of the salt, so we're just going to go ahead and let those go, and we'll taste it a bit later and see how this tastes, and if we need to add more water or more salt later. So I've decided to thicken this with a roux today. So I'm going to melt a couple tablespoons of butter, and I'm going to add a couple tablespoons of flour to that. Then I will add my cream to that to make kind of a cream-based bechamel sauce instead of a milk-based one, and I'll add that to the soup. So I'll be back as I'm ready to add the cream. So, of course, the traditional way of thickening this is to just simply crush some potatoes.
but I don't think I'm going to get it thick enough as much as I like today. So I'm going to make basically a cream sauce, thickened cream mixture to add. Normally for New England style chowders you would add the cream, but you add the cream after you already kind of get the thickening down, primarily because if you add it too soon, what will happen is it won't thicken properly. So once this starts to boil a little bit, I will add the next container of cream, and I'm going to add 2 or 3 of these. So half a liter maybe of cream max. So here you can see me adding the second thing of cream. And once this thickens, I will add it to the soup. And it's already nice and really thick. So let's go ahead and add it. So here we go. Now we're going to stir this all together. And we should get a super thick, hearty clam chowder. Now, as I say, if you don't like it quite this thick, just omit the roux. And you can just add the cream just straight there without making it into a white sauce first. So there we go. Now we're going to let this heat up for a few moments. Then we will plate and on to the taste test. And here is a full bowl of the clam chowder. And now for the taste test. This is really, really rich. Not just from the cream. Because I started with whole clams, the clam broth is just on a whole different level. This is really, really good. And if you make this, and you can get fresh clams, my recommendation is to use fresh clams. You can taste the clams. You may not be able to directly taste the bacon, but the hints of the smokiness are there. The onions and celery give this wonderful fullness to the flavor. It actually came together really, really well. If anything, yeah, it's not too salty, but it's not undersalted either. Keep in mind, I didn't add any salt. All the salt there is from the clams. So, if you find this content interesting, I hope I've earned a like and a subscription from you. And please check out my Patreon page if you'd like to support my work. My patrons get many videos early, in some cases, 3 to 5 months ahead of time. On top of that, if you make this dish and you make it very differently, I'd love to hear how you do it. All of us have our own recipes for these sorts of things if we cook it regularly, and sharing tips and tricks helps make us all better cooks. So please, if you make this and you make it differently, I'd love to hear how you do it differently in the comments. At any rate, recipes in the description. Bon appetit, and see you next week.